Hey guys, welcome to the final final video in examining stratification. We're going to go into a topic that's called social mobility in this video, and then we're also going to be examining poverty a little bit, which will kind of lead us into the next chapter. Remember, we're covering 2 chapters this week. So here we go with social mobility. So basically, as kind of the name of it goes, is where you socially mobilize, right? So you're basically moving in social mobility from one position in your society stratification system to another. And remember, this really depends on the openness or closeness of the system that you're in, right? So for instance, with the caste system, it's unlikely that you're going to move from one caste to another just because it's extremely difficult to do so. However, due to the openness of the social class system, you could go from, say, the lower middle class to the upper middle class, depending on the job that you get. You can also go from the lower class to the working class, depending on how much money you earn and things like that. So we'll be kind of examining the different levels, so to speak, of social mobility in this video. So there's a lot of different types of mobility that can occur. One of them can be vertical mobility. And you can either move, and the word mobility, that kind of implies that you can either go up or down, left or right, right? You can move in some way, shape, or form. And the vertical mobility is usually the one that people think about. It's kind of like climbing a ladder, so to speak, at your job, or going from, say, one social position to another of a different rank. So say, for instance, with Cinderella, she kind of goes from the lower class all the way up to being a princess, right? Eventually queen when the prince's dad passes away. So that's one example of vertical mobility. You can move upward. You can also, however, move from one social position to another one of the same rank, right? So for instance, it's a similar social position, or it can be something exactly the same. So if you kind of are an elementary school teacher, for instance, and you teach, say, 3rd grade, and then you move to another elementary school and you're teaching, say, 4th grade, that's basically kind of a similar thing, right? You're moving horizontally. You're still an elementary school teacher. The grade might change, but you're still kind of in the same social rank. You're still in an elementary school system. So that's one example of that. Versus perhaps if you go from, say, an elementary school teacher to a principal, that would be more of a vertical mobility, since that's more of a rank of prestige and esteem, which we'll kind of get into in the next couple slides here. So in thinking about prestige and esteem, what prestige means is basically the respect that you get. What connotation do you get when you say your occupation, right? And that's something that in American culture we are very driven to talk about, right? One of the very first questions when you meet somebody is, well, what do you do, right? I was working at my other retail job this past weekend, and I ran into the guy who was fixing the floor, and he was like, well, what do you do? What are you in school for? Because I look like I'm a college student still. So what kind of respect and admiration do you have for somebody who's a mechanic, or what respect and admiration do you have for somebody who's a retail worker versus a professor versus a principal versus a president of a company, right? So each of these different occupations holds some sort of respect and admiration. Esteem is just basically what you or a specific person has earned within that occupation. So what reputation do you have? Are you a really, really good worker? Or if you, for instance, you recommend somebody, oh, I really love my doctor, please go to Dr. So-and-so, or, you want to stay away from this doctor service or this practice, that kind of thing. What kind of esteem does that have? So that can kind of, that's basically on a specific person. So esteem is zooming in on a specific person. Prestige is basically the occupation as a whole. And you can kind of examine how the coronavirus pandemic has kind of impacted prestige and esteem a little bit, right? For instance, last year at this point, we were calling medical workers heroes. Same thing with retail employees. They were all known as heroes, heroes, heroes. That was kind of the big, huge thing. Versus nowadays, the esteem of some people, depending on your vaccination beliefs, might have been might have been minimized or mitigated because of the whole entire coronavirus pandemic. So just kind of something to think about regarding current events, and we're bringing up Corona in the next section as well. So this is kind of thinking about Corona. In addition to thinking about the prestige scale, the measurement of women's occupations and incomes is often neglected when we're talking about social class or just what in traditional gender roles the women's work has and been what's the word? Shoot. Anyway, what the women's work includes, I guess, would be one statement. So, so in thinking about women's occupations or just women's work in general, that's usually been neglected, and so newer approaches are trying to focus more on individual rather than family or household income. So that way we talk about an individual's income rather than just the family as a whole. And other approaches are trying to figure out prestige and esteem, are trying to put a monetary value on unpaid, what's traditionally known as women's work, but as society is evolving, just the normal domestic work, if you will. So thinking about the childcare that happens, thinking about all the housework, so cleaning the whole entire house and things like that. That's something that you're not paid for, but you still kind of have to do, and it's a lot of work. So what happens if we kind of put a monetary value to that? And this is what's known as the prestige scale. So it kind of goes from 0 to 100, and you can kind of see it's all the different occupations as well as the score that someone has. So according to this, and this is kind of just one way to kind of systematically measure prestige and how such it, or yeah, an objective measure, just to kind of see exactly how in categorical analysis, which is by categories, how are people kind of, oh, well, like, wow, you're a physician, right? That's something that people really like to be like, oh, wow, that's really cool. Or saying that I'm a college professor, you get like a, wow, you're a professor, right? And then I tell them that I'm a sociological professor, and they kind of get that like, what the heck is that? So I just say I'm a professor and kind of go from there. Versus say, for instance, if you were a newspaper vendor, that's only about 15% or a score of 15, so people aren't going to be really like, ooh, wow, such respect there. My personal gripe with this is that garbage collector, at least in society, that's kind of really looked down upon. But if you kind of think it from a wage perspective, garbage collectors can actually make pretty good bank. So it's just kind of interesting regarding that aspect of it. So in thinking about, say, for instance, vertical mobility, you go from, say, a janitor to a lawyer or to a college professor, right? We hear those kind of stories in the media all the time about janitors who work at universities, and since they work at a university, they get free tuition at some, or free classes or something like that, and work their way up. That would be an extreme example of upward mobility. Or I'm thinking this prestige scale, if you kind of wanted to do a horizontal mobility based on this prestige scale, you can go from, say, a carpenter, the thing of 40, to a correctional officer regarding the prestige scale. However, if you kind of wanted to move horizontally across, maybe going from a carpenter to an electrician, it's still kind of in the trades world, might be another example of horizontal mobility. Now, there's a lot of different other types of mobility as well. You can kind of think about, for instance, here in the US, it's a very big value that parents want their children to either do better or earn more than they themselves have been. So, and that's called intergenerational mobility. So there's changes in the children's social position compared to their parents. Normally, however, children do stick in the same social position as their parents, in the same either social class or just social position in general. They typically do stay. And then we can also just examine the different changes in social position in a person's lifetime. Right? And that's what's known as intragenerational, because it's you or a person. So with, for instance, the pandemic, that is going to be a really interesting thing to think about because some people lost their jobs during the pandemic. Some people had to work from home. Some people some people actually got bonuses because of being kind of one of the frontline people working the pandemic, that kind of thing. So a lot of changes have occurred because of this pandemic. So that's kind of just something to consider about when thinking about mobility. And so your occupation, your education, your gender, your race, ethnicity, all of these kind of impact your own mobility and the capabilities or possibilities of mobility as well. And that might be one of your discussion questions that you can choose for this week. I'm still trying to figure that out. So kind of think about that. Now, in addition to mobility, so how can you move from one social position to the next? Weber, remember our friend Weber, not the girl Weber. Don't know why I keep bringing that up, but he has this term called life chances. So that's basically the degree of opportunity, and our income and our social position really impacts these life chances. So it's kind of similar to when you're playing the game of life, for instance, and you go bankrupt or you win a cruise or something like that. All these different chances on life. And you can kind of see these different categories, right? So thinking about the access to healthcare and your life expectancy. If you have access to healthcare or really good healthcare benefits and things like that, you are most likely going to get better care. You're most likely to live longer and get government support as you age and that kind of thing. Thinking about your education or educational capabilities. If you attend better schools, you're on a better track to earn more money or just be connected to people who can kind of connect you to different jobs that pay more. Or even just, and we'll examine this in our education chapter, which is our final chapter that we're going to be examining this semester. But even in thinking about the different tracks in, say, high school, for instance, if those of you who went to public high school, you could have your regular track, you could have your college prep track, or you could have your AP track. And even that kind of sets you up with these different life chances. Thinking about mental health, right, already, in a couple slides from now, I'm going to go on a rant about homelessness and poverty and mental health. So if you don't have any mental health, or you're able to get that health care to assess your mental health and have a therapist or get the medication that you need to help your brain and other mental capabilities, you're going to be able to earn more and have a better income and mobility because of that, right? And you can kind of go through the rest of them here and see how exactly these are all kind of connected to your income and just your way of life. Alrighty, so for the next few slides, we're going to be examining wages and poverty and all that kind of economical stuff. So to kind of just start it off and just kind of thinking, about the job climate that's going on right now, and I'm just thinking about how the minimum wage has been adjusted for inflation. The minimum wage has been, like, federally, so basically at the federal level, is $7.25. Now, some states have higher and some states have lower. And it really just depends on, for the ones who are lower, like Georgia and Wyoming, it depends on what type of job that you are employed with. So for those who get tips, for instance, your minimum wage is actually around $5 per hour, just because you're kind of relying on those tips. That's the minimum. Of course, like, depending on the city that you're in or the district that you're in or county, that minimum wage is also going to differ. So for instance, over in California, it's kind of set up in some counties where there's a minimum wage to live in that county. But the federal minimum wage hasn't been raised since 2009, right? And so you can kind of think, okay, how is that good and how is that kind of bad, right? Especially since with every year, regarding inflation, your dollar is kind of worth less. So just kind of something to think about regarding that. And you can kind of see here in this chart how the value of minimum wage, which is basically what I'm trying to say, has basically fallen since the 60s. So that kind of leads to poverty as well. And in thinking about just the US in general, thinking about wealth and income, both of these are distributed unevenly within the US, right? And wealth is really more so. And the wealth of the top 1% of people exceeds the collective worth of the bottom 90. So if you kind of just take the 1%, that's worth even more than the bottom 90% of people. And then if we continue to kind of examine this wealth by race, that continues the separation even further. So for instance, in 2019, the median, so if you kind of take basically the middle mark of everything from 50% is higher and 50% is lower, these are how the median net worth for families were distributed by race. And you can definitely see there is a stratification going on, right? With white families almost with 171K versus Black and Hispanic families, which has far less. So there is something definitely going on there. And we can also examine this via the different poverty thresholds that are occurring as well. This is from the Health and Human Services Guidelines. And this is updated every single year depending on inflation and what a dollar is worth and everything like that. And so if you had a family of 4, kind of the benchmark of whether or not you live in poverty is if you have a family of 4 or 4 people in your household, if you earn $26,500 or less, you're considered to be living in poverty. Or if it's just yourself, if you make around 13K or less, you are considered to be in poverty as well. So that's kind of just the benchmark for there. If you recall, in thinking about our social class and how the boundaries of being in the lower class and things like that are a little bit more ambiguous than, say, the caste system. This is just one way how that poverty threshold regarding the lower class is kind of concerned. Like, yes, we do have a 26,500 for a family of 4, household of 4 kind of guideline, but and that's the reason why too, in thinking about that, well, what's included in there? And for many people who are in these types of jobs, earning this money, do they have benefits at all, right? Do they have medical coverage, dental coverage, that kind of thing? How are they living, right? Poverty does not necessarily equal homelessness. A lot of my students believe that because you live in poverty, you're homeless, and that is not true, right? We have different housing assistantships that are available to people. There's different ways to live in poverty while also having a house. So please don't get into your head that poverty equals homelessness. I'm not sure why a lot of my students think that, and if you have any indications as to why, please let me know, since I would love to understand why that is. But for the past few semesters, there's been this connotation that because you live in poverty, you're homeless, and that's not necessarily so. So poverty doesn't necessarily equal homelessness. Although many people who are homeless live in poverty, right? But there's so many different social examinations that we can go through in examining why somebody who is homeless is homeless, right? It might be because of their social situations, right? Taking on the sociological lens. Can they get a job? That's usually probably one of the number one. It's like, oh, well, homeless people can't get a job, right? Well, in order to get a job, what do you even need? You need to have good clothes, right? Some type of clothes to go to the interview and land the interview. You need clothes in order to work there. You also need to be able to be cleanly. You also need to be able to eat. So, and then regarding the homeless population as well, there is a massive amount of mental health issues in that population. Lots of schizophrenia going on, lots of bipolar disorders and things like that that they don't necessarily know that they have, in addition to the drug problem. So there's a lot of different social aspects of the homeless that kind of make them within that area. And just thinking about the poor, here's kind of the one way to visualize exactly how can we describe the poor. So here we have different groups that we can analyze, for instance, by age, and I still don't have my pen, race, and then you can kind of see that just doesn't even look good, sorry. And then if you have married or if you're single or if you were born in this country or if you're a citizen or not a citizen, as well as people with disabilities. So here you have, for instance, the percent of the population who are under 18 years old as of data in 2018 is about 23%, right? And the people who are under 18 make up about 31% of the poor. So that's kind of how you read it. So for instance, with and reading regarding to age, people who are 18 to 64 years old make up basically the biggest age range of the poor. They make about 56% of the poor, which kind of makes sense in thinking about it because that's a big group and a lot of people are of age of that time. And then thinking about it for race, this one might come as a surprise to you that it's whites, although minorities make up the other half of that. And then this one's a little bit interesting for an examining from a feminist point of view, because this is where we get the term feminization of poverty, because of how many female householders, it might be single moms or just single women and things like that, and how due to the different sociological aspects of life, such as the pay gap, the ability or inability to have childcare and get a job that actually pays for that childcare in addition to paying to make a life. That's kind of what's called the feminization of poverty, because if you're a female, you are just not in a very good spot poverty-wise. And thinking about that. So that's one example that a conflict theorist would be really examining, would be what's the female experience with living in poverty. If you're born in this country, you make up a big percentage of the poor, which kind of makes sense if you're thinking about educational wise. We have a lot of international people who come in here to get an education, or international wise to get some jobs, right? And those jobs are usually well paying. It might be because of the stereotypes within different countries, for instance, with Asia and their kind of socialization into the medical field, for instance, or even into the tech field in India. So, but for a great percentage, people who are kind of born in the US are making up the percentage of the poor. And then people with disabilities is around 20% as well. And thinking about this too, you kind of have to take into account regarding poverty, especially in current event times, how the coronavirus has kind of affected the poverty rate, right? People lost jobs, which increases the poverty rate, and a lot of different things that we could examine if you guys wanted to. But, and so the data has been affected by this, and in the future data as well, because of just how impactful the coronavirus has been on economic situations and everything like that. So, but the relative relationship between different groups hasn't changed. So these relationships, so and thinking about, say, for instance, female householders, they still are the number one in thinking about these different groups that are the percentage of the poor, native born. So that kind of thing, that hasn't changed. And then we can also think about poverty in different countries, right? If we think about poverty in different countries, your head might immediately go to Africa or something like that. But you can see here that the US poverty rate is actually higher than most of other industrial countries. So when we think about industrial countries, those are countries that are kind of similar to the US, more Western. And so this is a little bit of an older graph, and in the next one I'm going to show you the kind of differences how a couple of years makes. So kind of memorize this one and then go back, and then unfortunately I can't flip back and through when I'm recording things in this mode of recording. But I'll post a slide so that we can kind of see the differences earlier. So this is from 2010 or 2016, depending on how different countries report things, because everybody has a different way of reporting, unfortunately. And so you can kind of see how the US kind of leads the pack at 16.8%, followed by Mexico at a close 16.7%. And we kind of go all the way down from there, with France having a poverty rate of 8.2%. as a percentage of working age people. So those are who are working. But we're going to go to the next slide and kind of see how this has changed within a couple of years. So we go from 2016 to 2020, the latest year reported, or 2016 to 2017. So you can kind of notice that France is still hovering at 8.3%, but Mexico is still hanging out at 16. However, the US has almost jumped to an 18% within a couple of years. And while you can notice that these relationships haven't really changed, even though the coronavirus and the pandemic really increased the global poverty rates overall as well. So it's just kind of interesting thinking about the poverty rate in different countries, and how the US is still kind of leading all of these different countries, and how we don't really address this quite so much. And in thinking about poverty and thinking about this on more of a world standpoint, that's going to lead us to our next chapter. Remember, this week rather, we are covering two different chapters. So we're going to cover global inequality. We're going to quickly glance over it just because you guys will have a documentary to view that talks about global inequality a little bit more, so that we don't have to listen to me talk so much. But we'll kind of start our next chapter there. So I'll see you in the next video.